Oh God, we know that only love is what matters. This day, this hour, in this place, fill our hearts with your love. Amen. I do. I totally do. I love PBS. I do love it. I have said this before to you. I do love the public broadcasting system. From the early days of Wild Wild World of Animals and Sesame Street, to now more current A Chef's Life, Rick Steves, and Sherlock episodes, PBS is about joy. It is about inspiration. Can I get an amen? Amen. Incidentally, Sesame Street this day is getting transferred to HBO. I'm just not cool with that. Not okay with that. But friends, one PBS show that I am a wee sheepish to admit is high on my list, and maybe on yours, is that pompous British melodrama of Julian Fellowes, Downton Abbey. Now, if you've not tasted, all right, another amen. If you've not tasted this period piece soap opera-esque show, let me attempt in one sentence to summarize it. The intriguing interchange of an early 20th century Anglo aristocratic family and their servants who live in separate parts of a common estate. The stories and interminglings of upstairs privileged elite and downstairs underclass evolved to form an unexpected form of beloved community to the backdrop of lots of soap opera drama. And now, in its final season, Downton is zoning in on two beloved figures who live downstairs, the head steward, Mr. Carson, and the head housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes, who are engaged to be married. No real spoilers here. Well, I guess that was a spoiler.
That's a spoiler.
Well said, amen. But where they marry, and is very much untold yet, it is very much a matter of great intrigue. Will they marry on their own, in their own place, but will they use the extravagance of Downton Abbey to celebrate their nuptial union? Now, the action depicted in today's gospel lesson from John seems to mesh in well with the commotion of what might be a typical Downton Abbey wedding. Similar to 20th century Britain, weddings in 1st century Palestine were occasions of great celebration. While many did not have as much as they did in that part of the 20th century, there was a lot of money that was saved in advance of a wedding. Some people saved for years to marry those in their family, and sometimes that wedding would last for a week long. And this local wedding that we hear about, to which Jesus, his mother, and his disciples were invited, was in Cana, the Galilean hometown of Nathanael, that fourth one called by Jesus. And it is clearly no small affair. And if you afford me a little creative license, we can imagine the two scenes of Downton and Cana intermingled. Jesus' mother notices the wedding upstairs at Downton Abbey has run out of wine. She's concerned that the Crawley family will be embarrassed as poor hosts, so she summons her son to do something about it. They have no wine, seemingly dismissive, and with some prophetic words about this hour not yet arrived, Jesus comes and responds nonetheless. He takes leave of the Granthams, Lady Mary and Edith, and goes downstairs to be with the servants, Mrs. Hughes, Mr. Bates, Daisy, and Miss Patmore. After directing them to fill the huge jugs of water usually set apart for purification and washing, Jesus directs them to be taken to their boss, the chief steward, Mr. Carson, who inspects what he assumes has always been wine and is stunned by its quality and commends the couple for saving the best till last. Now notice in this story, who witnesses this miraculous transformation? It is those who are downstairs, the servants and the disciples, not the aristocrats, not the upstairs elite. Jesus, the one who later would get down on his knees to serve and wash his own followers' feet, flips societal expectation on its head once again. And the water is changed, and the world is changed. To those on the underside, God's glory is revealed. In a familiar setting of a wedding, in this special yet very common setting, God's glory is revealed to a common people. God comes in the midst of the familiar. And this is a major theme, of course, of John's Gospel. Remember how it begins without any fanfare, without any nativity story, no manger, no angels, no shepherds keeping their watch by night, no wise ones, just the words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Logos Word was God. This Logos, Jesus, is not the one described wrapped in swaddling clothes, but as the one who was, is, and is to come. through whom all things are made. And from the very source of what is comes that light that shines in the midst of the darkness and has not been overcome. And this is our Epiphany hope, that in the very midst of familiar real-life moments, God's light continually comes. And we declared this morning when we called ourselves into worship through the psalmist's words. Your people, O God, seek shelter in the warmth of your wings. We feast at your abundance, for you are the fount of life. In your light, we see light. God shines into the midst of the everyday experience so that we can see illuminated the way of God is the way of abundance, the way of transforming water into wine, wedding extravagance for all, not just those upstairs. The way of God is the way of wild wedding abundance, and we are all called to that banquet. Nuptial imagery, of course, courses throughout the biblical narrative. And wedding feasts are often linked to the commonwealth of God. And marriage becomes a sign of God's covenantal relationship with all of creation. We hear this morning from Isaiah that land is no longer forsaken, but is married to God. Creation and her people are secure in the shadow of God's wing. And there is much joy and celebration in this secure union. But of course, in our lived experience, there are often alongside such joys an equal helping of fears and anxiety surrounding marriage preparation. If you've ever been to a wedding, if you've been involved in one in any capacity, if you might be currently anticipating a coming marriage, you might be keenly aware that weddings, despite their beauty and joy, can often bring tension and anxiety. And it seems to me that worries around food may sometimes take the cake for production of the most nervous wedding participants. Will there be enough food to drink? Will the vegetarians be pleased enough with their meals? Will we be able to afford the catering costs? Where will people sit at the table? And in our gospel this morning, this is exactly what we hear from Mary, the mother of Jesus' mouth. They have no wine. Mary seems to be voicing that fear that there is not enough. But beyond the fear of not enough for the guests, perhaps she's also voicing there may not be enough love between the couple to get through the struggles that come in life. Or maybe not enough hope or faith or light. We can relate to Mary. She has a wise word here. It's often easier for us to look around and see what is lacking rather than what is emerging. Our eyes often see scarcity rather than abundance. But the water is changed to wine. Now, in Sunday school as a child, I admit I was really impressed by this story. It spoke of Jesus' amazingness. His ability to wow people was quite impressive. But in my adult years, I found this first sign of Jesus to be a bit odd. In light of a world in great need of fresh drinking water, I find it even more odd. Wouldn't a more impressive and significant miracle for the child of God be to change the Dead Sea into a living fresh water so that the poor could have consistent fresh drinking water? However, in thinking more about this text in the light of abundance, I find its message more profound than a miraculous provision of higher quality libation. Water to wineology is the display of God's extravagant generosity. And it calls all of us who follow Jesus to practice such generosity and half-glass full outlooks. It's important for us to mention that the idea of marriage can be problematic for some of us. For those who have not experienced marriage either by choice or circumstance, for those of us who have experienced broken marriages, for those of us who simply have a very low regard for the institution we, the church, or they, the church name, they, the state, name as marriage. Lest we forget that not until 2014, this Church of the Covenant and many of your clergy were refusing to call any weddings that happened here Presbyterian out of protest because of the previous polity of our church that restricted the definition of marriage to between a male and a female. Thankfully, that has changed in both our denominations. Can I get another amen? Amen. And finally, last year, our nation caught wind of this and changed its ways, thanks to the Supreme Court. However, we know the work for equality continues. Just over this weekend, our dear friends in the Episcopal Church found themselves disciplined by their wider Anglican communion over their faithful commitment to marriage equality. No, we are not there yet. How long? How long? We are called, friends, to see the glass half full as we wait and as we work. We are called to the wedding feast. While we may not all be called to marriage, we are all called to marriage. Marriage in a sense of a covenantal life that stretches beyond our own needs toward love of the neighbor. To work and love for animals, to work and love for the poor, to work and love for those living and working downstairs. As Dr. King said, we are called to develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness, and a true revolution of values is needed as we help build that beloved community. Being called to marriage is being called to something new. As a minister, I have a frequent honor of journeying with couples on their way into marriage. During our premarital counseling preparation, I make it clear that it is the moment when vows are exchanged in which the couple becomes married, in which the couple becomes new. It has nothing to do with some Hollywood repeated phrase, now by the powers vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I now declare you are married. The two individuals become new as a couple when they freely exchange their vows of the heart. I like how scholar Gerard Sloyan, in his commentary on John's Gospel, puts it. The Cana miracle tells us the disclosure in ordinary family festive circumstances of the hidden glory of Jesus. Cana's meaning is not the expression of divine power in a miracle, but rather a story of the Messiah discovered. 6 jars of 25 gallons, each of the finest vintage, turned loose on an already incandescent peasantry. This is the poetry of absolute newness. Only those who live in newness know what to make of it. Friends, John's Gospel calls us to live in that type of newness, to hear and live into those words of Isaiah 43. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now, it springs forth. This is the call to live in the here and now. And as we are still freshly into the springing forth of this new year 2016, I encourage us to drink deeply of the wine in new wineskins that is our faith. To drink deeply of this poetry that is Jesus, that calls us to think and see and act out of abundance. Do we see the wine flowing from the heart of this very congregation? Our figures for 2015, I am happy to say, came in thanks to the faithful work of our treasurers, namely Faith and others, and Nancy Stockford and Gretchen. Our figures from 2015 came in, and due to the wild generosity of this congregation, what was once a deficit year has now turned into a surplus year. And I tell you, more stories of abundance will come out of the pages of that annual report that is lovingly being constructed by Julie. I encourage us all to read that over the next few weeks. We'll see it in our hands next week. I commend you to these stories of wine overflowing, and I ask us to drink of those waters. Do we see such wine flowing in our world? Specifically on this MLK Sunday, do we see beauty emerging from the Black Lives Matter movement? Or are we bound to a glass half empty, fearful, or even skeptical about such happenings? The Sojourners community claims that the majority of white Christians are bound to the latter. They point to a recent Public Religion Research Institute study that reveals a devastating truth. While 80% of black Christians believe police-involved killings are a part of a larger pattern of police treatment of African Americans, around 70% of white Christians believe the opposite, that they are simply isolated incidents. And before we distance ourselves quickly from the term white Christians, it includes 73% of white mainline Protestants. So for those of us to whom that relates, this becomes a shameful indictment of the church. And it is our job to speak up against such a statistic. To see as this movement a continuation of the civil rights movement that our denominations fully embraced requires our tuning in to such events such as the Movement for Black Lives Reclaim MLK Weekend. If you haven't heard about this, this is the second annual event about this. And this event is about ensuring that MLK Weekend is forever known as a time of national, visible resistance to injustice. I want to read the one line from their website because it seems very provocative for us. Dr. King, they write, was one part of a larger movement of many branches that shaped our collective imagination for what change looks like in this country. From trans women of color at Stonewall who resisted police violence, to sanitation workers in Memphis demanding basic dignity, our movement has always been a big tent. Queer and straight, young and old, poor folks at the margins, students in the street, and more. This movement was built on a bold vision that was radical, principled, and uncompromising, and MLK's vision was one of a movement made of many parts that could be more aligned, more radical, and more visionary. Unfortunately, Dr. King's legacy has often been clouded by efforts to soften, sanitize, and commercialize it. Impulses to remove Dr. King from the complex and radical movement that elevated him must end. Now, this work, the Reclaiming MLK weekend, is also the work of the church. For a theology of abundance sees Black Lives Matter as a core part of who we are as people who follow the one named Jesus. Dr. King indeed was a radical transforming agent. He spoke about the nonviolent, fierce urgency of now as the fullest expression of his faith in the one who came in the name of love. And that same one, the Word made flesh, was a radical transforming agent. We hear about that today as water becomes wine. And so too, we are called to be such transforming agents, to be the ones who in the Spirit of Christ act in the face of perceived empty jugs and see their potential rather than the possible things that could go wrong. And just as Jesus took wine and provided for the guests at a wedding, they were then able to stay in community. So too, we will be inspired to do this work, this hard work, as we continue to be in community. For community matters. Abundance matters. I love how our reading from Isaiah began with the voice of God saying, "I will not keep silent." And this here, we hear the words of Dr. King again. It is always right. It is always the right time to do what is right. And so, of course, this movement and this idea to speak out takes courage. So I invite us again to return to that place that sometimes seems void of courage, the 20th century early British aristocracy, and we return to Downton Abbey. And I give you this image that is a spoiler alert, but it's from one of the early seasons in this show, when one of the Grantham daughters experiences a really rough break on her wedding day. For at the altar, her fiancé runs out of courage. And instead of uttering the words, "I do," bumbles out the words, "I don't, I can't," and runs away from the church, leaving her crushed alone at the altar. Friends, saying do requires courage. The courage to face that which is unknown. Saying I do is saying I can't do it alone. I am deeply grateful for the marriage that we are called to in this place. A marriage that reflects the covenant of God with all of creation as we care for one another, as we look beyond our own needs as a community, as we look beyond even the needs of this own church and look out to our wider neighborhood to spread the word of love, to spread the word of justice. For saying I do is saying yes to love and no to the powers of commercialism, materialism, and racism. Saying I do is saying yes to the ways of Christ in our world. So friends, may we, in the light of a God who offers us the choice to see things abundantly, may we say, I do, I totally do. May we be people of grace and courage who look forward to the ways of God's continual expression of light in our midst. And may that water be changed to wine, and may our hearts be open to such transformation. Amen.
Amen.
Friends, we are all invited to the wedding banquet, and so today we have a chance to sing a beautiful hymn which is often sung at weddings. When Love is Found, it is hymn 362 in your hymnal, When Love is Found.